It feels wonderfully great when your favorite job happens to be the best choice for anything, because that means you can simultaneously choose your preferred job and also choose the preferred job for the task. On the other hand, when your favorite job happens to be inferior, or in fact, the worst at a task, you're suddenly met with the choice of, do I play the job I want to play, or do I choose the one that is better for the team? If your preferred job tends to be in the lower rankings consistently, this can get very frustrating because it kind of means that you feel like you never get to play what you want to play without potentially feeling bad about it. The problem is that in a game where jobs are distinctly different in one or more ways, it is almost impossible to make all jobs equal at everything. Back when Machinist was down in the dumps in terms of damage earlier in the expansion, it was still one of the masters of the deep dungeons, because upfront burst damage, free mobility and all those random tools the job has was more helpful there. Despite Summoner being rather mediocre on the Savage Log rankings for the current tier, if you check the old ultimates, because of how actions are distributed at these lower levels, as well as the gear options, suddenly Summoner is the best, next to Red Mage. But even if it were possible to make all jobs equally balanced and equally good at dealing damage in any task they were presented with, ignoring what it would take to get such balance, this still wouldn't work. Why? Because there is a reason why we are so focused on just choosing the jobs that lead to the greatest possible damage. If any balanced combination of jobs, meaning 2 tanks, 2 healers and 4 DPS, has the utility tools required to deal with anything the boss throws at you, then it severely reduces the value of having better utility. Sure, if one particular DPS is better capable of assisting with dealing with a mechanic, that can be significant enough to make it a better choice. The problem there is that unless this somehow leads to a clear and easily measurable difference in performance for the group as a whole, it is easy to miss. In most cases, these kinds of extra utility allows groups to make more mistakes, and doesn't provide very much when the group is playing perfectly, or extremely well, or sometimes just well enough. This is what leads to the utility tax problem. Why should Red Mage be taxed such that it has a significantly lower peak damage it can provide for a team compared to Black Mage, just because it has a spammable raise and an extra raid-wide defensive cooldown? These advantages are as good as null and void if the group turns out to not need them. A much more clearly visible take on this kind of problem is the ranged tax problem. Over the course of Endwalker especially, bosses have grown hilariously large, well, at least figuratively, in the way that you can swing your sword in the general direction of Cocytus, and he will at the very least act like he got hit, almost regardless of where you are in the arena. Because of these massive ranges, the value inherent in being ranged is greatly diminished, meaning unless you need a ranged job for some other reason, like the party bonus, you might not actually care that much about a job having the utility of being ranged. This is further emphasized by most raid boss fights, at most requiring 4 players to step out of range of the boss to deal with a mechanic, the 2 healers, the mage and the ranged physical job. And what these 2 problems have in common, in a way, is that the only way to make these kinds of taxes fair is to make sure that these things make a difference in a fight. For the ranged tax, you'd need to make sure at the very least that any mechanic that is intended to be dealt with by a ranged job cannot be dealt with by a melee player without a severe loss in performance by the melee player. Without something like this, ranged jobs are mainly brought along either because of the party bonus or because of some other value, damage, that they might provide to the team. Naturally, if a ranged job is brought along due to the damage they provide, then the ranged tax isn't a significant factor in their loss of performance, you could say. For utility tax, this is much harder, because whether a utility tool is helpful at all in a fight can vary greatly, depending on the fight itself, what other jobs are present, and to some degree, who's playing. For instance, the more casual a raid team is, the more effective and powerful a tool like Red Mage's Verrays will seem. In contrast, the more hardcore a raid team is, the less helpful that exact same tool will seem, at least once proc is over, right? By that logic, a Red Mage might be a far superior job to bring in a casual raid team compared to Black Mage, simply because the Red Mage brings a far more varied toolkit to the table, where Black Mage mostly just brings Cradle and a lot of damage. Utility tags and ranged tags are two of the more common reasons, or excuses, as to why one job has to be weaker than another in terms of raw damage output. The cause for this is that while different jobs can have varying degrees of potential in different ways, some heal more, some can take more damage, some have specific unique tools, and some, naturally, can do more damage. However, most of these different capabilities are either put in the damage box or the utility box. Verrays is a utility, a defensive cooldown is a utility, having more reach through longer range is a utility. Because we only have these two boxes, it's easy to view them as two opposites, and having more of one comes at the cost of the other, as if it is some sort of sliding scale. Because if two jobs do the same damage, but one has more utility than the other, then that job would be the superior of the two. And this is the core of the issue, the reason why perfect balance is essentially impossible. Years ago, certain jobs provided unique utility which sometimes made them essentially mandatory in a group composition. For a somewhat simple example, certain jobs could apply and maintain a debuff on enemies that increased the damage the enemy took from slashing damage, piercing damage, or blunt damage. Slashing damage and blunt damage usually weren't particularly problematic because, for example, warriors could apply the slashing damage debuff, and since you needed 2 tanks anyway, it was pretty reliable to have this. And only monks relied on the blunt damage debuff, and they applied it themselves with Dragon Kick. The piercing debuff, however, was applied by Dragoon, and only Dragoon. But in addition to Dragoon, both Bard and Machinist relied on the debuff to be able to do good damage. This meant that if your group was going to bring a Bard or a Machinist, then it was all but assured you had to also have a Dragoon as one of your melee DPS. Basically, imagine that a job had a permanent trigger tag that only a select few jobs could benefit from. This meant that the viability of Bard, Machinist, and Dragoon in a way were linked due to this synergy, at least partly. If a Dragoon was good on its own, you might just bring Dragoon for that. But if Dragoon was bad, then it would directly impact the viability of Bard and Machinist because of this synergy. Another example is that jobs used to have much less consistent raid buff times. That is to say, some jobs had 1-minute cooldowns, others had 90-second cooldowns, some had 2-minute cooldowns, and others even had 3-minute cooldowns. This meant that jobs synergized by having their cooldowns align better, meaning that even if all jobs were equally good in a vacuum, the ones that had a better alignment of raid buffs might just come out on top. And yet, another example would be how Enmity management used to be relevant. Before Shadowbringers, Enmity management was far more significant, at least relatively speaking, both because the tank stance came with a downside, the tank did less damage, and also, the tank stance only multiplied enmity generated by around 3 or so, compared to today's 10. This meant that tanks were at least somewhat incentivized to at least consider using their damage stance instead, to get more damage out throughout a fight. This, however, put more emphasis on the DPS players managing their own enmity. But if a DPS hypothetically had to hold back for the tank to be able to go full blast, this would almost always be a loss, since the DPS could do more damage, of course. As such, a DPS job with more easy access to enmity management could automatically have an advantage over a DPS job that didn't have this utility. To take another example from Dragoon, before Shadowbringers, their elusive jump cut all current enmity they had in half on a 30-second cooldown. Most other competing tools with a similar power had a cooldown of 2 minutes or more, or only affected enmity generated in a specific time frame. This means that if you were ever in a group where the tanks had issues maintaining enough Enmity to let the DPS go full blast for any reason. A Dragoon might be capable of safely dealing more damage than any other DPS, simply because they could repeatedly cut their Enmity in half whenever they were reaching the tanks. Nowadays, Enmity is no longer concerned to manage, and damage type specific debuffs aren't really a thing anymore. Add to this that all raid buffs align naturally with each other, and you have a situation where no jobs in particular have some sort of synergy. This means that the best you can do to maximize your group's performance is to bring the utility you need and then as much damage as possible. Which means that if you don't need Red Mage's Verraise or Magic Barrier, then Black Mage will probably perform better. In such a team, if you really would much rather play Red Mage, then it really sucks that the job is being penalized for having these useless utility tools, right? But to understand why this somehow becomes necessary, we simply have to imagine that all jobs in a specific category, tank, DPS, healer, all somehow contributed exactly the same damage to a team. By contributing, I mean that if Black Mage contributed 10,000 DPS, then a Red Mage with Embolden somehow also only contributes 10,000 DPS, regardless of team composition. If this was the case, why would you bring a Black Mage over a Red Mage, aside from, I like playing Black Mage more, of course. That is a fair argument, but also perfectly circles back to what I said at the start of the video. Do I play the job I want to play, or do I choose the one that is better for the team? And that is ultimately why perfect balance, not the monk ability, is essentially impossible. If all jobs do the same damage, then we look at utility options. If all jobs have the same or similar utility options, then which one is easier to play? If all jobs are equally easy to play, then it is probably easy to imagine that all the jobs are the same. As such, I think personally that the best and most reasonable a game like Final Fantasy XIV can do is keep the jobs within a reasonable power level of each other, such that all jobs are capable of beating the content, so that you at least aren't forced to make the decision to switch to the stronger job for a specific fight. Something that might help to balance things out a bit in terms of the utility tax issues is to give the more selfish jobs more utility, so that the more utility focused jobs can be allowed to be buffed to be closer in power level to the rest of the cast. If Black Mage had its own suite of utility tools to compete with Red Mage's Verraise and Magic Barrier, then it would not be as much of an issue for either job if Red Mage was closer in power to Black Mage, would it? But what do you think? Maybe you have some good ideas of what kind of utility jobs like Black Mage and Samurai could get to fill in these gaps. Maybe you have a suggestion for some nerfs to existing utility job utility to make it more fair to buff their damage some more. Whatever it is, I would love to hear about it in the comments. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you want to support me and my channel, you can let the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. And if you want to give even more support than that, you can also become a member of the channel like these wonderful people here. Fun fact, Ninja's Shadow Fang action, which was removed in Endwalker, had quite a trip through time. Originally, it was a step 2 combo finisher that applied both a dot and a slashing resistance reducing debuff. Then in Stormblood, it was moved to a step 3 combo finisher. In Shadowbringers, it then lost its slashing debuff, moved back to a 2-step combo finisher, and later was removed from the combo sequence altogether and was made into a longer cooldown similar to Gunbreaker's Sonic Break. And then with Endwalker, the action was removed.